Eritrea is blessed with extensive history of media and information, which includes a variety of literary sources, including books, magazines, and newsletters. That is still an endeavor that needs to be pursued in earnest as Eritrea moves into the next phase in its development agenda. An information infrastructure to meet the demands of an increasingly interconnected global economy in which the people of Eritrea will have an important and indispensable role in defining Eritrea's true image and character. Despite the hostile colonial environment and the denial of formal education to majority of the people, Eritreans found ways to express themselves orally, through art, and even print across the globe, and most especially in Eritrea. Here, we present a glimpse into Eritrea's rich media culture and history, and will hopefully inspire Eritreans to aspire to inform and emulate the skillfulness which our forefathers presented the Eritrean voice. The first Eritrean newspaper appeared post-World War II during the British administration of Eritrea. In 1942, Abewolde Aboldemariam, an educator, journalist, and a prolific writer, was appointed by the British administration to be a director and editor of the Sominawi Gazette, Eritrean weekly news, and he worked there until 1948. In 1950, he became the editor of Hanti Eritrea, also known as One Eritrea, the newspaper published by the independence bloc movement. Dahai Eritrea, or Voice of Eritrea, was also one of the independent newspapers of the 1950s. Its maiden issue came out on 21st of September 1952, and last issue number 50 was published on August 6, 1954. Eritrean journalists and writers both in Eritrea and in the diaspora can learn a thing or two about journalism, its uses, its reach, its contributions to society, etc. from these Eritrean gems. Eritrea's newspaper Hanti Eritrea and Dahai Eritrea played an important role in the development of national consciousness. Nationalist media did not reappear until the start of armed resistance in the 1960s and 1970s, and they have laid a strong foundation for the development of Eritrea's media sector. Whilst the powers to be and their media worked to keep Eritrea out of public attention, the Eritrean liberation movements and the people of Eritrea worked in earnest to raise awareness, and cursory look at all the information publications attests to this truth. Development of media infrastructure in Eritrea is a work in progress and has achieved a lot. Considering the turbulent neighborhood and extensive propaganda, in advancing Eritrea's development strategy reflects in the young nation's impressive achievements and accelerated economic growth. A media-literate citizenry is essential to building and sustaining democracy, and it's an area that the people of Eritrea have a greater advantage. Eritrean people are also owners of their news and information outlets, another great source of pride. Eritrea has had the benefit of learning from the mistake of others in the African continent and is threading with the same critical and deliberate strategy to achieve its goals to develop the capacity and quality of Eritrea's media sector with the participation of the people. For example, when the Eritrean People's Liberation Front wanted to establish a radio station in the liberated areas, it reached out to the people of Eritrea everywhere, including its diaspora. In January 1978, a newsletter named Eritrea in Struggle, a publication of the Association of Eritrean Students in North America, announced a fundraising campaign. In the publication, the newsletter said, "With the number of people in the liberated areas, in villages, towns, and cities, in the millions, the APLF is faced with the most urgent task of disseminating mass education on a large scale. To facilitate the acceleration of mass education, the EPLF considers it of prime importance to set up a radio station in the liberated areas. Moreover, with the lightning advance of EPLF, the colonizing forces, their imperial masters, and other reactionary elements are stepping up their slanderous campaign against the Eritrean people's just and revolutionary struggle, and in particular against the EPLF. Attempts to isolate the Eritrean struggle and the EPLF through news blackouts, lies, slanders, and distortions by the imperialist press had to be combated. One of the fundamental ways was to establish a radio station in the liberated area of Eritrea, from where the EPLF could present the true voice of Eritrean people and expose the distortions by the imperialist and reactionary news media. The Eritrea in Struggle newsletter continues and says, "It was in light of these central tasks of the revolution that it was decided to launch a fundraising campaign to assist in the establishment of the radio station." Similar fundraising events were held in other Eritrean diaspora communities around the world. On January 1st, 1979, Dimtz Hafash, or Voice of the Broad Masses, was launched in a place called Fah, located in Sahel region of Eritrea.
دمتي حفاش إريترا صوت الجماهير الإريترية.
So, from the very beginning, it was the voice of the people as it was established by the people. At first, the broadcasts were in Tigrinya and Arabic, and soon, on 16th of February 1979, followed transmission in Afar language, and in August 1979, broadcasts in Tigray language began. On the 20th of February 1999, broadcasts in Nara language began, and today, Voice of the Masses, or Dimtz Hafash, the voice of the Eritrean people, broadcasts in all Eritrea's 9 languages. Dimtz Hafash made a significant contribution in raising a certain level of awareness of citizenship and facilitating cultural integration among the Eritrean population. It was particularly important in mobilizing the whole society to participate in the armed struggle for independence. The broadcasts were recorded on cassettes and distributed throughout the world. Eritreans understood the importance of the information and worked tirelessly to make sure that Dimtz Hafash was also distributed in print. Eritreans painstakingly transcribed each broadcast and sent them via fax and mail. All this went on during the liberation struggle, when most Eritreans in the diaspora were new refugees, still adjusting to life in exile and working some multiple jobs to sustain the livelihood of their families on one hand, and supporting the liberation movement with the other. This was while the world and those shedding crocodile tears for Eritrea and her people worked to suppress news and information to and about Eritrea. In Eritrea, like in most African countries, radio is the most widely used news and information media. Today, its satellite broadcasts reach millions across the world and is playing an important role in Eritrea's social, economic, and political development. Successive colonialists, especially the Ethiopians, suppressed Eritrean cultures and language. Curriculum was changed in the schools and Eritreans were forced to use that of Ethiopia's. Eritrea's history was deliberately distorted to enable Ethiopia's annexation. In addition to fighting for Eritrea's independence, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front also worked to revive and preserve Eritrea's culture, and the radio played and continues to play a role in that endeavor. But Eritreans were also constantly kept informed by the publication of variety newsletters, periodicals, etc. During the 30-year struggle, in addition to providing news and information about the struggle, the challenges and opportunities, they also served as educational tools in the EPLF's effort to reinvigorate and preserve Eritrea's culture and language, expand social services such as health and education, establish grassroots organizations, and establish the rudimentary institutions of the government in the fields of Eritrea. Underground hospitals and factories were established, and the EPLF was producing medicines, sanitary napkins, sandals or shida, and more in the liberated areas. It was also conducting extensive literacy programs. Today, in addition to Dimtsa Hafash, Radio Sawa, Radio Zara are also adding to the variety in the needs of Eritrea's diverse population. With the advent of the internet, today's youth have an important role to play in advancing Eritrea's information and infrastructure. Since most already own the technological tools, the skills, and the confidence to let their own voices be heard, Eritrean voices are found all over cyberspace, in blogs, social networking sites, and internet-based radio, and more. Across Europe and the United States, there are community radio stations maintained by the community and run by volunteers. Here are a few examples. The Eritrean Community Radio in Minnesota,
እዚ ራድዮ ማሕበረሰብ ኤርትራ እዩ ኣብ ኔያፕለስ ብ9.3 ኤፍኤም ኣብ ሴንት ፖል ድማ ብ106.7 ኤፍኤም ይመሓላለፍ
Radio Machete, Voice of Eritrea in Washington, D.C., Medeb Siasa, and more. There are many more across the United States. In Europe, there is even more advanced Eritrean information infrastructure that's global and in use. Here are a few examples of community-owned and run radio and television programs. Radio Dimtz Eritrea in Gothenburg, TV Dimtz Eritrea in Stockholm, Embassy Media in London, UK, TV Rahawana in Stockholm, Voice of Eritrea, Stuttgart, Dimtz Eritrea, Gothenburg, and Radio Machete in Mannheim. Eritreans everywhere also have access to print media. The popular national newspapers Al Hadisa in the Arabic language and Hadas Eritrea in Tigrinya language are published daily. Eritrea Profile is an English language paper published twice a week, and Eritrea Hadas is the weekly Tigray language paper. But that's not all that's found in Eritrea. There are many publications that are widely read and extremely useful sources of news and information. For instance, Menisei, Tirikta, and Galed are produced by the National Union of Eritrean Youth and Students, Ag-Izzo, a publication of the National Union of Eritrean Women, Hedri, a publication of the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, or PFDJ, Ta'ataq, a publication of the Eritrean Armed Forces, Hizbin Polisen is a publication of the Eritrean Police Force. Similarly, there are publications from the Ministry of Education and other ministries. There are also publishing firms in Eritrea that help reduce the cost of publications and encourage Eritreans to produce learning and other materials. There are also numerous well-written books written by Eritreans available all over the world, so the information is not scarce in Eritrea or Eritreans. It is wide and varied. Speaking of books, did you know that the oldest book written by an African was written by an Eritrean? Well, it was. The author was Gebreyesus Hailu, who was born in 1906 and passed away in 1993. Gebreyesus Hailu was a prominent and influential figure in the cultural and intellectual life of Eritrea during the Italian colonial period and in the post-Italian era in Africa. Hailu's novel, The Conscript, is based on a true story of Eritrean conscript deployed to Libya by the Italians, whom Hailu met on his way to study in Italy. Tigrinya title, Nizta'askara Nahada Menisei Zer'i Hada Zanta, was written in 1927 and first published in 1950. And it has been translated by Girmay Negash, a professor of English and African literature at Ohio University. A must-have for all Eritreans and a great read for all. But let's move on and see how else Eritreans remain informed about the prevailing issues, the pertinent issues of the day. Eritrean television, ERITV, is available within Eritrea and abroad via satellite dish 24 hours a day. It's streamed live by various Eritrean diaspora internet sites such as Denden Media. It is not an easy task to run a television station, and there are hundreds of Eritreans working round the clock to produce the variety of programming that's now available on Eritrean television. The diaspora Eritreans are actively engaged, not just as viewers but also as producers of programs for ERITV. During the independence of Eritrea and other historical liberation anniversary events, along with the various activities broadcast satellite live from Eritrea, the various Eritrean websites around the world and the thousands of pictures and stories shared on Facebook and Twitter enable both Eritreans and others, especially Africans, to learn more about Eritrea, its people, and its struggle. The extraordinary footage taken then by the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF, the interviews with those who participated in those battles, the footage of the colonial regime's brutal bombings of the liberated Eritrean cities and villages, etc., keep us all glued to our television and computer screens. There is much more to tell about Eritrea's long and arduous struggle and the tenacity and perseverance of her people and yet to be exhausted EPLF archives, which house thousands of hours of raw footage and volumes of print documentation. Eritreans can and will rely on them to continue to tell the Eritrean story for generations to come. Eritreans all over the country enjoy access to the other media too. The satellite channels are available all over Eritrea and everyone seems to have access to them. There is no government censorship and the internet, even though slow, is available to all. The lessons to be learned for our times from the legacy of our ancestors and the Eritrean national media are that for a newspaper to be viable and flourish, it must represent the national interest of the country. No newspaper could be considered independent while it received financial backing from foreign sources and advocates issues contrary to the national interest. Our forefathers were nationalists first and foremost, and they rejected all kinds of foreign interventions in Eritrea's internal affairs, and they steadfastly refused to be corrupt and bribed by colonizers' money. Secondly, national media must have a serious commitment to journalistic integrity, fairness, objectivity, and must have a balance in their news coverage as well as editorials. Our ancestors have left us a high standard of journalistic tradition that any newspaper aspiring to national status must adhere to. Indeed, so as we move into the future, we look forward to developing Eritrea's news and information infrastructures by increasing human resources capacity, training more high-caliber journalists, and utilizing technologies available to produce material worthy of our heritage and history.